Right, hello everyone. I hope you can all hear me. But welcome to today's webinar, which is called What's on the Horizon for MS Research. And today we're hosted by the MS Society. So I'm really glad to be able to present this webinar today. It's the first time we've done something like this, so I'm really grateful for the invitation from the MS Therapy Centres to present today. But let me just introduce myself. I'm Sorrel. I'm the Research Communications Manager at the MS Society. So I'm going to be your host for today. So we've got about an hour from 2:30 to 3:30. So hopefully we can have a really nice interactive webinar today. But what I'll start by doing is giving a presentation, sort of setting the scene about MS research, what we know about MS already, what sort of new developments have been happening in research. I'll give some detail on the treatment development process, and I'll talk about a few of the kind of hot topics that are really active areas of research at the moment. And I wanted to take a particular focus on progressive MS, because I know it's a real area of priority for us at the MS Society and for really the research community around the world. So I'll sort of come on to that a bit later in the presentation. But I think it would be really great today if we could get you guys involved that are listening. So please do ask questions, and then I'll kind of come to the questions after I've given a bit of the presentation. But it would be great to have some questions in, and then we can have a really nice interactive webinar. We've had some questions in already that I can see, so I'll come on to those as soon as I can. So to start off, I'm going to speak for sort of about 20 or 30 minutes, and then I'll come to take some questions at that point, and we can go back and forth a little bit more. So just to start off, I want to give a quick disclaimer. So I work in a research team at the MS Society, but I'm not a medical doctor. So I have expertise in research, but I'm not actually sort of a qualified healthcare professional. So if you've got any questions today about sort of treatments you're taking or really specific things about your current situation with MS or your treatments, I'm just going to have to signpost you to a healthcare professional because I just don't know enough to be able to give you specific advice. But if you've got any questions about the research side of things, that's what we're here today to talk about. So, just to set the scene a little bit and to get used to how I'm going to talk about MS today, let's just kind of go back to the basics and think about what is MS. So, we know that MS affects over 100,000 people across the UK, and that it's three times more common in women than in men. But when we break it down, MS is a condition of the central nervous system, so that breaks down to the brain and the spinal cord, as you can see here. So the building blocks of these two organs that make up the central nervous system are the neurons. And you can see a schematic picture of a neuron here on the right-hand side of the screen. So these are the building blocks of the central nervous system. And you can see a cartoon of a neuron here. So these are the cells that carry messages throughout our body. They're really important cells. So a neuron would work by a message comes in at this end into the cell body here, and it travels down the nerve fibre and gets transmitted on at the other end. So it's really about transmitting messages. But to do that, this nerve fibre in real life can be incredibly thin and really long. So that makes it very fragile. And so our bodies produce this really fascinating, amazing substance called myelin, which wraps around the nerve fibre and helps to protect it from damage. And you can see the myelin shown here in orange. So the myelin really provides this kind of physical protective layer, actually protecting the nerve fibre, but it also helps to speed up the transmission of the nerve signals. So it helps to speed up the messages travelling. But what we know happens in MS is that something goes wrong with this. So usually in our bodies, we see that the immune cells are here in the blood vessels, so the immune cells are what work in our bodies to fight off infection. So they play a really important role, and it's absolutely crucial for the normal functioning of our bodies that we have these immune cells and they're working well, but they're found in the blood vessels. But then here in the central nervous system, we have the nerve cells. But in MS, what seems to happen is, for reasons that we don't fully understand, these immune cells start to come out of the blood vessels and enter the central nervous system. They enter the brain and spinal cord. And once they're there, they start to attack the myelin coating. And this is really important because in MS, once this myelin becomes damaged, it means that the messages become disrupted. So this nerve cell isn't functioning as well as it was. So this myelin has got broken down, the messages are sort of slowed down or distorted or disrupted, and this leads to a lot of the symptoms that we associate with MS, so things like blurred vision, pins and needles, sort of problems with balance, all these types of things. So this is what we quite often call demyelination, so damage to myelin. But what research has shown, and this has only really become apparent in the last few years, is that at the early stages our bodies do have an amazing capacity to repair myelin. So just inbuilt in our central nervous system, we do have a way to repair the damage that's happening. And this is what we see in relapsing remitting MS. We see periods of damage and then periods of repair or remission. But we've also seen from research that as we age, we tend to lose this ability to do myelin repair. Just over time, our bodies get slightly worse at doing this. So it becomes harder to repair that myelin layer. And actually what can happen if this myelin repair continues, that the underlying nerve fibre can get damaged. So this really fragile nerve fibre, if it continues to be exposed, it can become damaged itself. And what this means is that if this fibre is broken, the message can't be sent because it cannot get through. And once we have a nerve fibre being broken, we know that what our bodies can't do is repair the damaged nerve fibre. So this means that if the message isn't getting transmitted, this is where we do start to see permanent disability in people with MS once the nerve fibres actually start to get broken down. So when we think about this as a problem, let's start to think about ways that we could actually target it and try and stop that damage happening, stop all of those things going wrong. So one kind of strategy that you could imagine to try and stop that process from happening is called immunomodulation. So this is really a very powerful strategy. If you can imagine, if we're thinking about these immune cells damaging the myelin layer, what if we could just dampen down or stop that immune attack? And this is this immunomodulation strategy is how all of the licensed therapies for relapsing remitting MS currently work. So when I talk about the licensed therapies for relapsing remitting MS, this is the disease-modifying treatments that you will have all heard of. So things like the interferon betas, Tysabri, Copaxone, Gilenya, Aubagio, and Lemtrada, and Tecfidera. So we have a number of these licensed treatments for relapsing remitting MS, and they all work by, in some way or another, modulating the behaviour of the immune system. So either by sort of killing off some of these immune cells or sending them elsewhere in the body or just modifying their behaviour in some way, they all work by dampening down this immune attack on the myelin. So this is really important, and these therapies have been shown to reduce relapses and slow the progression of disability in people with relapsing remitting MS. So it's absolutely fantastic that we have these therapies available to people with relapsing remitting MS. And I mean, access to these treatments is another question, but while we're focusing on the research today, I think it's really a testament to the success that's happened in MS research over the last 20 years that we have these therapies available. But to continue talking about how we can stop MS, we understand a lot about immunomodulation now. We have some therapies, but the second strategy is myelin repair. So to target this damage to the myelin, perhaps we could actually try and stimulate the body to repair that damage. And we know that that does happen in the brain and spinal cord already, but if we could develop new therapies that can target this myelin repair process to replace the damaged myelin, repair it, and then protect this nerve cell. So myelin repair is a massive area of research ongoing at the moment. And the final strategy is neuroprotection. So this is a bit of a broader term, but it really describes any therapy that could help to protect the nerve cell. So to prevent this damage happening to the nerve cell, protect it and keep it happy and healthy and keep it functioning. And that's a really key concept just generally in biology of neuroprotection, trying to keep the nerve cells healthy. But so both myelin repair and neuroprotection are two therapies for which we don't have any drugs licensed at the moment, but there's a lot of research ongoing and there are trials going on in MS into both myelin repair and neuroprotection strategies. So I'll come on to that much later in the talk, but I think this sets the scene, and you could actually imagine that by targeting each of these strategies at the same time, we could really stop MS in its tracks. So we could dampen down the immune system, which will reduce the attacks. We could replace the myelin that does get damaged, and we could make sure we're protecting the nerve cells and stopping them getting damaged. Okay, so I hope that sort of set the scene. What I'm going to do just now is just have a look at the questions to see if we've had any questions in yet about the things that I've covered so far. Right, excellent. I can see we've had one question in already, but I think that's something that I'm going to come to right at the end, because it's a question about trials, so I will come back to that. That's from somebody online, but I will come back to that question if that's okay. I think it'll make more sense. Okay, so I'm just going to come back to the PowerPoint presentation now. So I want to talk about really how far we've come already in MS research, and I really do think that MS is quite a unique condition in the amount of progress that has been made. So although, actually for people with MS, it's incredibly frustrating to be living with the condition and feel like there's not much progress happening in research. But when we look back, I do think that there has been a great deal of progress made, and we've come a long way, even in just the last 20 years. So just to set the scene, 20 years ago we didn't have any licensed disease-modifying therapies, so we had no therapies for people with relapsing remitting MS. And we only knew of one gene that was linked with MS, so we didn't really understand anything much about the genetic aspects of the condition. We also really didn't understand much about the environmental factors that were associated with MS, and even research into symptom relief was very, very limited. But today, oh no, excellent. I'm getting nervous about my PowerPoint now. Okay, so today we actually have 11 licensed disease-modifying therapies, all for the relapsing remitting stage of the condition. But that's an incredible development in 20 years to have 11 licensed therapies. We now understand a great deal more about the cause of MS. We know there's over 110 genes that are associated with determining your risk of developing MS. We have a much better understanding of the risk factors associated with MS, so things that are in your environment, things that you can be exposed to in your lifetime that can influence your risk of developing the condition. We also developed much better symptom management treatments. So these include things to help people manage fatigue, help people manage bladder and bowel symptoms, to help people manage pain, all these things to kind of help people day-to-day living with MS. And very importantly, we've seen the first positive trial in progressive MS. So this was a phase 2 trial that was published last year, and I'm going to come on to talk about that a bit later on if we have time. But I think this was a real kind of tipping point in terms of progressive MS research and really kind of moving the focus of research onto progressive MS. So what I'd like to do is spend a few slides talking about sort of the MS Society and our role in research. So the MS Society is the largest UK funder of MS research as a charity. On average we invest between £4 and £5 million per year just into research. We started funding research in 1956, and if we trace it back to that point, in today's money we've invested over £150 million since then into our research programme. So just today we're supporting 70 different projects and they total over £20 million. So we really do prioritise research as an organisation. But we have a set of overriding values that help us determine what research projects to fund. So we really prioritise the fact that this research needs to be relevant to people affected by MS, and we involve people with MS at every stage of our research funding process. It's incredibly important to us that people affected by MS decide what we fund and how relevant it is to them. We always strive to fund research of only the highest scientific quality. So if it's not good enough, if the science isn't there, we won't fund it. And we're an evidence-based organisation, so we base all of our decisions on evidence, and we really need that there. So we have our most recent research strategy, which came out in 2013, where we, as an organisation, decided to focus on progressive forms of MS. Now, I've sort of talked already about the fact that we do have these treatments now available for relapsing remitting MS. So, the gaze of the global research community and ourselves has now moved to progressive MS, and a big part of that for us is to develop a much better understanding of myelin repair. So we outlined this in our research strategy. But we also wanted to understand more about the impact of MS, to look at people's whole lives and the bigger picture of what MS means to people. And a big part of that was helping to develop better symptom management treatments. But we've also launched a lot of new collaborations in the last few years, so that's a big part of our strategy. So just to give a few examples, we've now got a collaboration with the UK Stem Cell Foundation. We also have a global collaboration that we're part of called the Progressive MS Alliance, which is MS societies from across the globe working together to try and drive research into progressive MS forwards and find new treatments faster. Okay, so 2 years ago, we, as an organisation, the MS Society, launched a priority setting partnership with the James Lind Alliance to try and find the top 10 research priorities shared by people affected by MS and healthcare professionals. So this was a long process. People were able to submit questions. Anyone across the country that was affected by MS could submit a question that they wanted to see answered by research. And these questions were whittled down for a long process. And eventually, through a series of workshops, we finally reached our top 10 research priorities. So I've just put the top 3 here, but they may not surprise you, but our first priority is to find treatments that are effective to slow, stop or reverse the accumulation of disability that's associated with MS. But our second priority is to find out how MS could be prevented. And our third priority is to find treatments that are effective for fatigue. So clearly these are the things that have been outlined by people affected by MS that are really important to them, and that's absolutely where our priorities lie now as an organisation. Now we've got this challenge and we need to start trying to find the answers to these questions. Okay, so our research programme is roughly structured into 2 sides. So first of all, we invest a great deal in biomedical research. This is kind of the classic laboratory research that you think of, which is trying to explore ways that we can cure and treat MS, and also to try and understand the condition better, to understand what causes it. But we also invest in care and services research, and this is really to help people live their lives to the fullest and cope better day to day with MS and cope with the symptoms. So this is all about symptom relief and developing better services for people affected by MS. So together we hope that by investing in both of these aspects that will improve diagnosis, treatments and services and support. So what I want to do now is talk about a few aspects of biomedical research. I just want to check in with the questions at this point, if you can just bear with me. Okay, so we have a question about trials that I'd like to come back to that's from Sally. And there's somebody asking about the risk factors in our environment. I think that's a really great question. And there's also a question about stem cells, which I'd like to come on to. So what I'll do now is I'll talk about risk factors, because I think that's a really great question. We were just talking about the causes of MS, actually. Okay, so Roger, this is hopefully going to answer your question. I mean, the cause of MS has been a really huge area of research for, I mean, as long back as we've really known that MS was a condition. But the one thing that we've learnt through all of that time is that there isn't one single factor that can cause MS. So MS isn't a condition where there's one single trigger, or there's one gene, or there's one single factor that everyone that has MS around the world has been exposed to. That's just not the case. MS is much more complicated as a condition. So everything that research has shown us so far indicates that MS is caused by a combination of genetic factors and also environmental factors. And these two things kind of interact, and there's some kind of interplay between them to determine whether or not someone develops MS. So some of these environmental factors you can see on the right here. So they include things like vitamin D, infections, smoking and obesity. So what I'm going to do is talk about each of these things on the right hand side in a little bit more detail. Okay, so first of all, genes. So I've said that there's not one single gene that causes MS, and that research investigating genetics and sort of the differences between the genetics of people with MS and people who don't have MS has shown that there's over 100 genes that can influence your risk of MS. So this means that each of these genes has a really tiny influence on someone's risk of developing the condition. Interestingly, of this list of 100 genes, many of them play a role in influencing the immune system, and a lot of them also seem to be associated with other autoimmune conditions. So I do think that's really fascinating, but it makes for quite a tricky concept to understand. So I think the best way to actually get your head around it is to think that, so what we know is that there's over 100,000 people in the UK affected by MS, but if we break that down, it's about 1 in 600 people. So if you've got a 1 in 600 chance of developing MS, so that doesn't take genes into account at all. So if you have a parent that has MS, your chance of developing the condition is about 2%. So that's a fair bit higher, but it's still a very, very low chance. And if you have an identical twin that has MS, you share all of your genes, you've got exactly the same genetic makeup as your twin. If they have MS, you have about a 30% chance of developing the condition. So that really tells us a lot about how important genes are in determining your risk of MS. So at the moment, we don't have any gene that has enough of an impact on someone's risk of developing the condition. So there's no one way that someone could have a test to find out if they're going to get MS. It's a bit too subtle, it's a bit too complicated for that. There isn't a way that we could say, like, this gene will mean that someone will definitely develop MS. We know that the environment has such an important role to play that genes just aren't the whole picture. So if we come on to the environmental factors, first of all, to talk about vitamin D. This is a really kind of hot topic, and we at the MS Society in the research team, we get a lot of inquiries about it. So one thing that's been seen for a number of years is that MS does seem to be more common further away from the equator. So countries that are further away from the equator seem to have a higher prevalence of MS, that more people get MS in those countries. So several research studies now have suggested that vitamin D could have a role to play in that. So vitamin D is a vitamin that's produced in your skin in response to exposure to the sun. So in theory, the further you live from the equator, the less sunlight you might be exposed to and the less vitamin D you might produce. So there is some research to suggest that vitamin D deficiency might play a role, but currently it's really not clear how this happens. So at the moment, although this is a hugely active area of research, and if you're interested to read more, that we have written a couple of blog posts about it in the MS Society research blog, so you could check out our website if you want to know more detail. But currently the things that we don't know is we don't really understand whether vitamin D could be able to prevent MS. We don't know if taking vitamin D supplements or getting more sunshine could prevent you from getting MS. Research just hasn't shown the answer to that yet. We don't have evidence. We also have no idea whether vitamin D could be helpful if you have MS and you want to treat the condition, if it could help you if you already have MS. And we also don't know what kind of dosage is needed, and crucially we don't know what dosage is safe, so having too much vitamin D can be harmful for you as well. And finally, we don't really know whether supplements can work as an alternative to getting sunlight. So currently, what we're saying is that if you have any concerns about your vitamin D levels, the best thing to do is speak to your doctor, because it is possible to get a vitamin D test, and there are things that you can look into. But I mean, vitamin D is important for a range of health conditions wider than MS, and there are certain groups that should or could take vitamin D supplements, if people like pregnant women or people over the age of 65. So if you have any concerns, you can speak to your doctor, but at the moment, this isn't an established link, and we don't fully understand the role of vitamin D in MS. But an absolutely fascinating area of research, really. So I want to come on to talk about infections. So again, this is still a bit of an open area of research, but there's been some evidence that a virus or some type of infection might act in some way as a trigger to increase someone's chance of developing MS. And one of the most likely candidates that's been investigated so far is the Epstein-Barr virus. So this is quite a common virus in children. It causes glandular fever, but many people carry antibodies to the virus but haven't actually had glandular fever, so you've been exposed to the virus but you haven't actually had the condition. But it's been quite widely studied in people with MS, and it seems that if you have been exposed to glandular fever, you have a higher chance of developing MS. And this, if you think about what we've already talked about in terms of what causes MS, and the important role of the immune system, this just kind of, it does all fit together. It loosely makes sense that being exposed to anything will influence your immune system in some way or another, and that could impact on the chance of whether you then go on to develop MS at a later stage. But again, I just want to say this is a really, really really open, active area of research. So one area is that we're funding a study at the University of Birmingham currently, which is investigating this link between MS and the Epstein-Barr virus. But we're also, it's interesting that there's another clinical trial ongoing currently of an antiretroviral treatment called raltegravir. So this is a phase 2 clinical trial that's currently happening in relapsing remitting MS. So this is a HIV treatment, so it's licensed already, but they're investigating whether this could have any role in helping in MS. So it'll be absolutely fascinating to see the results of that trial as well. So I think that covers it as far as I was going to speak about the cause of MS. But I just want to come back to this slide and just say again that there's no single factor that can cause MS. And everything that research has shown us is that it is this interplay between your genetics and the environment. So unfortunately, a lot of the situation with MS is that things are more complicated than they might be. But this certainly does seem to be the case for the cause. But what this does show is that there's no way currently to really know whether or not someone will develop the condition. And there's no reason why your sort of family history, or if you have MS, it should put you off starting a family or anything like that. It's not a simple straight inheritance of the condition like it is for some other conditions, like things like cystic fibrosis. Okay, so I'm just looking back at my questions that I've had sent in. What I'm going to do is just come up with this PowerPoint again, drop back in at another point. So we're about halfway through the webinar now, so if anybody has any further questions they want to send in, please do. I think I'll come on to your question, Sally, and talk about trials a little bit. Why isn't there as much research into progressive forms of MS? If there's so many treatments for the relapsing remitting form, why hasn't progressive MS had the same attention? So we've kind of roughly talked about progressive MS and the situation, and I think it's very powerful to say that we now have all of these effective treatments that can reduce relapses in the relapsing remitting form of the condition. But in progressive MS, that's not the case, and there is a huge unmet need in terms of treatments, effective treatments for progressive MS that can slow the progression of the condition. And it's incredibly frustrating that there aren't any treatments that are currently available that can slow that progression or stop that progression. But I mean, to sort of set the scene a little bit, it does seem to be that a lot of the reason behind that is that there has been less understanding of the progressive form of the condition. Actually, we've had a question in that fits really well with this. It's from Jane, who said, has there been found to be any benefit, however small, in taking beta interferon for someone that's suffering from secondary progressive MS? So beta interferon is one of the treatments that is licensed for relapsing remitting MS. And that's a really good question, because just for beta interferon, but for also the other treatments that seem to work in relapsing remitting MS, all of these disease-modifying treatments that work by modulating the immune system, they don't seem to work in progressive MS. And when they have been trialled, those trials haven't been shown to be successful. So just to take your specific question, Jane, about beta interferon in secondary progressive MS, there was actually a review published just in 2012 where they reviewed all of the research done into testing beta interferons in people with secondary progressive MS to try and verify whether they could be effective in slowing progression. And when they looked at the results of all the trials that had been conducted, they found that there had been 5 trials of beta interferon in people with secondary progressive MS. So there's over 3,000 people that had been in these trials, and they found that beta interferon didn't prevent the progression of disability in secondary progressive MS, so it didn't work. It didn't help slow progression. So I think this is quite a good way of illustrating what's happened in a number of the trials in progressive MS over the past few years, is that when researchers have tested immune modulatory treatments in progressive MS, they haven't worked as well. They haven't seemed to show a slowing of progression. And so that's where this kind of less understanding comes from, that we can't just target the immune system in progressive MS. It's a more complicated stage of the condition, so we need to try a different tactic. And that's where myelin repair and neuroprotection really come into importance. But it's also true to say that the technology hasn't really been there. We needed new ways and better ways to image the brain and spinal cord and to really see what's going on inside the brain of people with progressive MS. But that technology is improving. It is really getting there. Particularly over the last few years, we've seen enormous strides in new, creative, kind of innovative ways of using technology to visualize what's happening in the brain. So although I do think it's a major problem and a huge unmet need, the fact that we don't have treatments to slow progression. I do want to kind of give a very positive note that there is real momentum at the moment in progressive MS research. And so I want to just give just a few examples of some of the ways that things are moving forwards. So the really big, really exciting one is the Progressive MS Alliance, which is charities across the world getting together to fund research to speed up the development of treatments. This is happening on a global scale, so already, and this is just the start, there's been an investment of £17.5 million over the coming 5 years. So the Alliance started to fund research last year in 2014, but they want to move forwards from this year. They want to fund bigger and more ambitious projects, and they will announce more funding later this year. But the countries that are already on board and contributing money and driving this forwards is ourselves, the USA, Italy, Canada, Australia, and also the MS International Foundation. But there's also many of the other MS societies getting involved at a bit of a smaller level and kind of supporting the Alliance. So I think this is really exciting, and it really shows how across the globe we are sort of dedicated to pushing forward research into progressive MS. I think the world is recognising the need for treatments. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is clinical trials that are happening now and are planned and have already reported results. So some of you might have heard of the MS SMART trial, which got underway just earlier this year, sort of in January 2015. So this was it's co-funded by the MS Society, the NIHR, and also the National MS Society in the USA. And this trial is all about trying to find a treatment that will slow or stop progressive MS. So there's 3 different drugs being trialled in MS SMART. So testing 3 drugs against the placebo means it's really kind of innovative. It's the first time that a trial like this has been run in MS research ever, actually. So it's a really kind of innovative, new, groundbreaking trial. And each of these 3 drugs are repurposed drugs. So you can see at the bottom of the screen here, testing fluoxetine, which is currently licensed. Oh, excuse me, I'm having screen issues this end. Oh no, excellent. Testing fluoxetine, which is a treatment licensed currently for depression, riluzole, a treatment licensed for motor neuron disease, and amiloride, which is a blood pressure treatment. So all of these drugs have shown real promise in the laboratory and in human trials that they could be neuroprotective. So I know I sort of mentioned neuroprotection at the start of the presentation. So that means that all of these drugs could help to protect nerve cells from damage. And I mean, that really means that they could have real benefits in progressive MS. So this trial is now underway. It just started this year. And there's a number of sites across England and Scotland where people will be recruited to the trial. But it's in people with secondary progressive MS. But they do have a website, which is www.mssmart.org, where you can find out a bit more information. But we're really excited. We funded a lot of the kind of underpinning work for this research, and it's a real groundbreaking trial. It's the biggest trial in secondary progressive MS that's been funded in the UK at least. So we're very excited about this trial. So it's going on for 2 years, so it's likely to be maybe 3 or 4 years until we start to see the results, but it's a very kind of exciting step forward in MS research. But we have already had a trial in progressive MS that's already reported positive results, which is incredibly exciting. So the drug simvastatin was trialled a number of years ago, and finally the results were published last year. So that simvastatin is another repurposed drug, so it's already licensed to treat high cholesterol. But again, it's shown promise that it could be neuroprotective, so it could protect nerve cells from damage. So this phase 2 trial, published last year, is called the MS STAT trial, and 140 people on this trial, half took simvastatin, half took the placebo. And people in the simvastatin group, it was shown to reduce brain atrophy, which is the shrinkage of the brain over time. As those nerve cells become damaged, the brain does start to shrink very slowly. But people on the simvastatin had a reduced rate of that brain atrophy, and they also had reduced disability progression over 2 years. So this is a really, really exciting result, and it's one of the first positive trials in progressive MS, which really is a huge step forwards. And I just want to sort of say that last week at a conference in the US, we heard the announcement of 3 further trials of drugs that have been shown to protect nerve cells. So these have only been announced at a conference, and we need to wait to see these results published, and we need to see more trials taking place in progressive MS. But there is a lot of momentum there, and we are seeing more and more drugs now, either myelin repair drugs or neuroprotective drugs, showing positive results in trials, which is incredibly encouraging. Okay, so I want to come on to talk about treatments to answer your question, Sally. So Sally was asking about, are there any upcoming trials people can get involved in, and how can you find out about them? So just let me answer that before I go into too much detail about treatments. There absolutely are upcoming trials, and you can get involved. The best place, I think I have a slide with this website on it actually. But so at the MS Society, we don't run any trials ourselves. We do co-fund some trials, but we don't administer trials. So we can't sort of help people with recruitment directly, but what we can do is signpost people to the best place to find more information, which is this website here. So I hope you can all see that. So this is the clinicaltrials.gov website, which has, so it's a huge directory of all the trials going on around the world. So if you go there and you search for MS or progressive MS or anything that you're interested in, you can find that information about trials going on, and there should usually be a contact address. But now the NHS Choices also has an excellent site about clinical trials where you can find information there as well. But if you want to look on the MS Society website, we do have a bit of background information about trials and things that you would want to consider before you thought about getting involved, because obviously that's a very personal decision that everyone would need to take. We sort of wouldn't encourage or discourage anyone from participating in a trial, but there is a lot of information out there, and you can always, the best place to go is to speak to a healthcare professional, so your neurologist, and they should have much very up-to-date kind of information about clinical trials that might be going on near you. So I do just want to spend a little bit of time talking about trials and the research process itself, because I think that's can be really, really useful. So developing treatments, and I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the development process and kind of explaining a little bit about why research can seem to take such a long time. And it absolutely is a slow process. But I think that it's absolutely crucial that every step along the way that you'll see here does happen. Because what we need to know really is we need to have treatments that we know are effective, and also that we know are safe. And those two things are crucial, and we need to prove that, and we can't skip any of these steps along the way to get there. So if we look right at the start, a researcher has an idea, maybe they think, okay, I think that this molecule or this pathway might be important perhaps in helping to repair myelin. So now the researcher has to apply for funding and get the grant, get the lab assistance to actually test the idea in the laboratory. Then after that point, once they've done these experiments to demonstrate whether or not their idea works, see what's happening in the laboratory, we've got to gather their proof, publish their results, even before anything can happen, like a clinical trial, or before anything can be tested in humans. We need to know whether the idea actually has any credibility, because we can't just start testing things in people. So we have to have this background of evidence to test the idea. So once we have a good evidence base, the researchers can possibly take this forward to a small clinical trial. We call this a phase 1 trial. So this is really looking at the safety of the drug to see if it's safe for people. But then we can start to move to a mid-phase trial and a few more people to see if it's safe, and start to test the effectiveness of the drug to see whether it's safe and whether it's effective in a larger group of people, and also to start looking at the dosage. And then finally, in a large-scale clinical trial, to really demonstrate whether this drug is effective in groups of people with MS, and whether the safety is still there in a large group of people. So only after a drug has passed phase 3 trials can it then go to a licensing body like the European Medicines Association, and then the NHS NICE will consider whether to approve it to allow it to be available on the NHS. And then after that, even then the research isn't over, so all drugs go into a long-term safety and monitoring system. So, I mean, these numbers here are very vague, but I just want to give you an idea of the scale of research and why it does take so long. But each of these stages are absolutely crucial. So, having said that, this can seem kind of daunting that any new idea has to start all the way back here, and it's going to be years and years before anything happens. But we do have a number of treatments at these stages for MS, right now today. So, let me just show you. So first, for relapsing remitting MS, so this slide is just showing phase 2 trials, phase 3 trials, drugs that are licensed and drugs that are available. So we've talked a bit already about the fact that we do have these 11 licensed treatments. So 4 of these are beta interferons. There's 4 different beta interferons available. And we also have all these drugs that are all immune modulatory therapies that are available now. But there's also other trials going on in phase 3, drugs moving into the licensing stage, and drugs that are in phase 2 moving into phase 3 trials. And there's a lot of ongoing research, and we're hearing results kind of every couple of weeks at the moment. But even in progressive MS, we don't currently have treatments available to slow progression. We do have treatments in phase 3 trials, moving from phase 2 to 3 trials, and currently in phase 2 trials. So I just want to be clear that what I'm showing you here is just a snapshot. These are just a few selected drugs, and this isn't the full list. It's just some drugs that are currently in trials at the moment. So we have all of these drugs listed on our website. If you can see this email address at the bottom of the page, so that if you search on the MS Society website for treatments in the pipeline, we do have information about all of these drugs that are in trials currently. So hopefully that kind of gives you a bit of an idea about the ongoing research that's happening right now in both types of MS, in progressive and relapsing remitting MS, that there is a great deal going on, and we do have late-stage trials ongoing right now today. So we've briefly discussed about clinical trials here on this slide. I have a question from somebody called Julie here who's asking, how is the BAF312 trial going? I've got to say, Julie, I'm really sorry that I don't know about that trial. That's news to me, but that's absolutely possible. There's a lot of trials going on at the moment. So if you're interested, have a look on the MS Society website, but drop an email into research@mssociety.org.uk, and we could probably have a look at what ongoing trials there are and try to get back to you with a response. But I'm afraid that one I do not know off the top of my head, so you have to excuse me, but please do drop us an email, Julie. So Roger's asking about diet, or if there's any food types that can help with MS, or if there's any trials ongoing to see whether any diets could help in MS. Actually, that's a really, really good question. So diet is a really tricky topic to do trials in, just to start with. If you can imagine saying to, in a clinical trial you need hundreds of people, so you can compare people who take the treatment or do whatever intervention you're testing, and then you've got to have another set of people that don't do it, so you can compare the two and see if the treatment's having any benefit. So if we said to, say 200 people, you all have to test whether chocolate can have any benefit in MS. So none of you can eat chocolate for the next 2 years, and then the other group can eat loads of chocolates. Then we look back 2 years later, and you can imagine that many of these people probably wouldn't stick to that trial, and it's very, very difficult to make sure that no one's had any chocolate whatsoever, and we can really rely on that fact. And I mean, that's just one food type. It would be pretty difficult to do a trial of any more restrictive diet than that. So diet trials are really difficult to run, but what we know so far about diet and MS is that there isn't any diet that specifically has evidence that it can benefit MS. So I just want to be clear what this means is that there haven't been that many trials, but what trials there have been haven't shown any benefit to following any specific diet. But having said that, I think it's really important that people kind of follow whatever seems to help them. So if you prefer to follow a certain diet and that makes you feel better, then I think that's probably the most important thing. So kind of, as an evidence-based organisation, we can say that we don't have any evidence that diet can influence the underlying biology of your MS. But we know that diet can influence, a lot of aspects of your life. It can influence your mood, all of these things. It's bigger than just MS. So I think diet is a big question. But I hope that's kind of helped to answer your question there, Robert. That there isn't a specific diet at the moment that's recommended, or any evidence around diet and MS. Okay, so I'm just going to come to one more question. We are actually coming towards the end of our hour, actually. So if anybody has any final questions. Oh, so I've actually just had a response in I'm really sorry, I've lost the question of the person who's asking about BAF312. One of my colleagues has just dropped me a line to say this is treatment that's also known as siponimod. It's currently recruiting in secondary progressive MS. So our treatments in the pipeline address is at the bottom of the page here. But if you look here, siponimod is a trial which is currently recruiting in secondary progressive MS. So this means that the trial is probably underway already. So it's being tested in people with secondary progressive MS. I'm sorry that I don't have any more information currently, but oh, here it is, siponimod in phase 3 trials. So if you have a look on our website, there'll be more information there, and I hope that helps you. So thank you to my colleague Emily for her help with that question. I actually don't know if we're going to have time to cover many more questions. What I'd like to do is just, if anybody else has any further questions they want to send in that are sort of quick ones, we can go to them sort of briefly. But I wonder if I'd just like to talk really briefly about ways you can find out more about research. So, I mean, the MS Society aren't the only organisation out there that fund research. We're not the only ones that talk about treatments and sort of the evidence and what we know about research as well. But because I'm talking from the MS Society today, I'm going to obviously signpost all of our excellent resources. So the first one to really highlight is our research magazine, which is called Research Matters. And that's where we kind of talk about all the latest developments and innovations and what's going on right now around the world. And so this is our latest issue, which was just out last Friday, just talking about the impact of MS research. So the research that we've funded and other organisations have funded over the last few years, and the difference that that has made to people with MS already. And you know, what we hope to do next really as well. So if you want to get hold of that, just get in contact with the MS Society. Even just through our helpline, our info line, you'll be able to get hold of a copy of that. So our main website address is here, and on that site you can find links to our research blog. We also have a YouTube channel where you can watch videos of researchers talking about MS. And the best place to email if you have any inquiries about MS is helpline@mssociety.org.uk. And so what I'm going to do now is just wind up, because we are coming to the end of our time, and now I'm going to get cut off at exactly 1:30, so I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to have to bring the webinar to an end, but I just want to say thank you all for tuning in today. I hope you've found this useful. I know I haven't actually covered a lot of the things I wanted to talk about today, and so it would, you know, I just would like to say there's a lot more research going on into symptom management treatments, things for cognition, things for fatigue, exercise research, bladder and bowel research. There's a huge amount of research going on, not just the things I've talked about today. If you are interested in getting more information about any of those things, do go to these places that I've just signposted you to. So I just want to say thank you all for watching and sending in your questions. It's been really, really interesting doing this for the first time. So I'd just like to say thanks very much to the MS Therapy Centres to sort of have this opportunity to talk to you all today. So yeah, at this point I guess I'll just say goodbye, and I hope that you all have a lovely day. And yeah, thank you very much for tuning in and listening.